Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And today, hello, there's a little cat. And today, kind of still in the same place with the cat and a dog looking after it. They've currently got the zoomies, so they may end up running around. So you may see them in the background. If not, not the worst thing, but I think I can hear one of them coming now. Or just running around. There we go. So anyway, I wanted to talk about the Orwell Prize for political fiction. And so the Orwell Prize is one I've been following for a few years, and essentially, as the name would suggest, not only the political fiction part, but obviously the fact that it's named after George Orwell. It's a prize that really looks at fiction that has a political edge to it. And the thing that's been really good to see from the last few years as well has really been that they take political fiction in a very loose and very open sense. So you've got politics around, I don't know, for example, environmentalism, you've got politics around immigration or kind of political corruption or anything and everything else. And so that what I think is really special about that is it really opens it up to sets of books that really challenge the reader in different ways. And these are books, both this set of 8 books that I'm about to talk about here and previous shortlists have been ones that have challenged my thinking in some really interesting ways. So let's get on with talking a little bit about them. I'm going to go by author surname because we haven't had a winner yet, so there isn't a kind of one to go on. But I'll try and be relatively quick with them because there are 8 books. But let's get talking. First up, going alphabetically by surname, is Merle Collins with Ocean Stirrings. And in many ways, this is the book that I think was probably the bigger surprise, at least from my side, on the list, because it's not one I'd heard of at all. The other 7 are all ones that I'd either read or was planning on reading. And so this sort of mystery 8th book was a bit of a surprise for me, but one that I actually really enjoyed overall. So the core idea of this book is taking the story of Malcolm X's mother. You know, I said political fiction can be kind of quite a broad thing. So taking Malcolm X's mother as a character and really looking at the kinds of experiences that shaped her and therefore that maybe shaped how she raised Malcolm X or how the kind of essentially the family that Malcolm X would have grown up in. And it's really interesting in several ways because this book is told in a very almost sing-song kind of way. It is often sort of interpolated with various bits of kind of Creole nursery rhymes or poems or songs, and so it kind of has this sort of slightly song-like quality to it. But what I thought was really interesting about how it approaches this more broadly is it takes this core idea of Malcolm X and his sort of upbringing, but you know, a good half of you probably get, I think you get a good about 50% of the way through this book before Malcolm is even mentioned, because this book really is about his mother. And so a lot of the story is about her being a young woman in Granada, I think it is, and talking about moving, you know, so her kind of early politics, the people she's surrounded by, the kind of material conditions for people around her, but then also the world that she is leaving to move to, at one point in the book, Canada, and then the US kind of comes up as well. And so I think there's something really interesting in the way this book approaches that. And although sometimes it's a bit more opaque, because, you know, you're sort of in sort of nursery rhymes or whatever else, there's something so compelling about the way this book leads towards certain key actions and key moments that would have been the important moments in sort of potentially someone like Malcolm X's life. So, you know, without spoiling anything, the death of loved ones or kind of political things going on. And so I think this book does some really interesting things in approaching quite a woman whose life is probably much less examined. I say probably, is much less examined than someone like Malcolm X's. So yeah, really, really interesting. Next up, we have Percival Everett with James. And I've spoken about this book in a few other places already. I think it's exceptional. It is a book that seeks to sort of retell Huckleberry Finn, essentially, or kind of be an addendum to it, but told through the perspective of Jim, or James as he is sort of in this book. And Jim in the original is a character who speaks in a very particular way that is very much the kind of, you know, and some of the criticism for Huckleberry Finn is also that Jim is sort of portrayed as this sort of slightly slow or unintelligent character. He speaks in a way that would have been fairly typical for enslaved people, well, presumably, you know, meant to be kind of how people spoke at the time. Although some of the criticism of Huckleberry Finn is often that it intentionally plays him off as this sort of slightly silly, stupid character. But what we get instead in James is this character who speaks incredibly eloquently and intelligently, is often, you know, a good few steps ahead of all of the other people in the book. So, you know, in Huckleberry Finn, there's a scene where Huck walks around and he dresses up as a woman to try and get through into like a town, and he sort of partly gives himself away fairly early, but he's fairly convinced that he's going into this being kind of unregisterable and, you know, you can't, unrecognizable rather. And so you've got this moment in James where James just sort of looks at him and he's just like, oh God, what is this guy doing? And kind of completely gets him. But James is also playing this odd role. When he's Jim in everybody else's mind, he has to pretend to be slow or illiterate or all these other various things. And as soon as nobody else is around, he's making notes, he's writing things down, he is having these other richer conversations with himself that are far more intellectual than any other character in the book. And so there's something really fun about the way this book plays with that, and really plays with sort of narratives around slavery, narratives around all these other things. I just think it's really fun and really clever, but with this really important edge to it. There's, as funny and as silly as this book can be at times, there's something really intelligent and provocative and important going on at its core, and that's why I think this book is really exceptional. Next up, we have Orbital by Samantha Harvey. And this is, again, where sort of this being political fiction is a really broad church, because in many ways, Orbital is more obsessed with space travel and things around that. But there is something that comes up in it about the ways that we look at the world and the ways we approach things. So we're inside the minds, mostly in this book, of characters who are in space, who are wondering what comes next. It's this sort of very strange existence where the typical things that would bother the average person don't really exist. You know, you're not out there trying to make money or pay taxes or do all these other things. You're just sort of existing in this very sort of liminal space almost, where you're watching the earth from above. And the book kind of has all these really deep reflections and thoughts about what it means to be human and what it means to be alive and what it means to be part of the earth. And I think there's something just really special about it. It's a very short book and incredibly lyrical at times, so these really beautiful passages of looking out across the world and trying to understand things. But there's a slight sort of terror or menace underneath some of the sentences that I found really compelling. There's something about the way this book is approaching the kind of isolation and sort of otherness that comes with being so physically detached from the rest of the world. It's a book that I think plays with that really intelligently. And I just think it's a really quite special book that I actually really want to go back and reread, because it was just so beautiful to be in the moment of the book itself. Next up, we have My Friends by Hisham Matar. And he is no stranger to a good prize list. Both sort of, I think, has been involved in shortlists for around the Pulitzer, which I think he won, and also the Booker previously, and a few other prizes here and there. But Hisham Matar's My Friends is a really beautiful book, I think, that examines the sort of the fallout of political moments and what that does to somebody, but also this sense of identity and nationality and nationhood within that. So a core part of the book, and some of the key friends in this book, are two characters who have both I mean, escaped Libya feels like in some ways the wrong word, but in some ways the book is also saying that is the right word. There are two characters who have left Libya, and particularly the politics around the civil war and the politics around political corruption come up quite regularly in the book. But the two of the main characters, particularly our main character and this one friend who we see right at the beginning of the book, a core part of their friendship is this sort of this unspokenness about what they've come from and what they're doing now. So they're both at one point in London, and it's just this very strange moment for them to think about being in London, a country that is so far away from Libya, but where the sort of politics of, where UK politics impact Libyan politics, or, where kind of someone like Gaddafi is in the news and all these other things. And as part of this book, it also examines something that I actually didn't know had happened, which was an incident at the Libyan embassy in London. And this book features that quite prominently, where this is a big part of the kind of malaise that the main character feels at being in London, that he kind of can't escape Libya no matter where he goes. And he meets all these other people, and sometimes he meets Libyans, and there's a sort of strangeness to meeting them outside of Libya and having conversations about who are we now? What does it mean to be here? I just think this probably hits the nail on the head of like political fiction. This does that really intelligently, I think, without becoming too heavily political. As in, I don't think this book is arguing a certain thing. I think it's just using the backdrop of politics really interestingly to frame a really beautiful story about friendship and about loss and about belonging and what it means to be from a country. So I think this is just a really intelligent and really beautiful book in many, many ways. Next up, a book that's appeared in quite a few places, Ordinary Human Failings by Megan Nolan. And it's a book that deals quite a lot with the after effects of a sort of local scandal, as it were. Without going into too much detail, because I like how the book unravels this. A big part of the book is around somebody who is accused of a crime, and the kinds of ways that a neighborhood or a kind of community can turn on each other, but also turn on trying to find the culprit. And so the book deals a lot with the complicated nature of that, particularly when it involves young people. So there's a young girl who's gone missing, and the book deals with the various ways that different people approach something like this. So some members of the community go all out to try and find the child and find the culprit. But then as soon as some information changes, people can very quickly turn on each other, turn on other members of the community. They can react in very, very different ways. And so this book really plays with this idea of kind of a mob mentality, but also the various ways that we consume news about something like this, the way that the kind of news cycle itself becomes part of the story and the problem and everything else. I think this is a really intelligent book, and it's been a really lovely joy actually to see this book appear on so many lists, because it's just a book that has, I think, a lot more to say than it first appears. And I think it's just a really well-crafted book. And just like My Friends by Hisham Matar, Caledonian Road by Andrew O'Hagan feels like such a political fiction book. And again, I don't mean that in a negative way. This book it has quite a bit that it's focused on. Andrew O'Hagan in this book is exploring particularly a set of characters living around Caledonian Road, or a lot of action takes place around it, which is sort of North London-ish. And the story kind of focuses a lot on various forms of politics in a broader sense, but also in a kind of slightly more party political government kind of style thing. So we have a lot in this book about political corruption, but equally we have a lot of conversations about culture wars. And so this book opens pretty much with a lot of conversations around sort of woke versus whatever kind of conversations, quite a lot about class, and particularly early on in the book there is a conversation between one of our main characters and a young man who is he's a sort of the older man in this scenario sort of looks to this younger man to be almost a spokesperson for the downtrodden and the working class and the youth of today and blah blah blah, and it puts a lot of this kind of pressure on this young man to sort of be this voice for a generation. But equally there's a lot where he doesn't really get it, and where we almost see a sort of the ways that he's almost weaponizing this young man to be hello little cat there. We also see how he's sort of weaponizing this young man as a voice to kind of almost be like, this is the way I'm going to either market something or get the right conversation out there or do whatever else. And it sort of toys with the fact that actually a lot of the time when when people are sort of giving voices or giving platforms to certain people, it's almost a very temporary form of sort of power sharing. It's very much, I'm the person with power, I'm going to give you this for about 5 seconds and then take it back. And this book plays a lot with that, this kind of, some of the ways that these things can be quite performative. The book also goes into a lot more of a kind of political thriller, scandal kind of thing towards the end. And I don't want to spoil any of that. It gets really quite, very thrillery and very kind of punchy. My only criticism, my only sort of main criticism of this book, I think, is that at times it does feel like it's a little bit focused on issues with a capital I, as in it's very much like, we're going to do corruption, we're going to do this, we're going to and there's nothing wrong with a book having a direction and a point it wants to make. I think sometimes I felt it was a little bit too explicit in the book, that it was gunning for those issues, but I still don't think that takes away from the book as a whole. I think it's a really interesting book. It's very well told, really engaging, some really funny, really clever moments to it as well. So I do really recommend it, despite that kind of minor quirk that I have, of sort of not, finding it a little bit trickier at times. Next up, we have The Future by Adam Thelwell. And I read this last year for the Goldsmiths Prize, which is sort of innovative experimental fiction, and this is very much in that wheelhouse. It's a story that, where to begin? It's sort of, at some points, is sort of French courtesans and kind of court politics and all of that kind of malarkey. And then other times it's sort of something else entirely. It plays a lot with the kind of, the sense of court politics, of the idea of how people try to navigate various things to survive. But actually, in many ways, as the title of the book sort of hints at as well, it's kind of anachronistic at times. It's a book that plays a lot with time. And so you've got things happening that are sort of audacious and bombastic and wild, and then you realise it's sort of taking place in the wrong century, or things don't quite make sense. And that's kind of the purpose of the book, I think. It's a book that's a lot about unsettling you in quite fun ways, typically. And it's just this sort of raucous ride through quite a lot of things. I really enjoyed the experience of reading it. Trying to describe what actually happens or what it's about is a very different thing. So kudos to the judges for both prizes, who have managed to sort of distill that into something else. I think I struggled with that, but it's a really engaging read. It's just a little bit off the wall, which I think is kind of part of the appeal for it. And last but not least, Blackout by Justin Torres. And this book is, in many ways, almost completing the circle of everything else that we're talking about in terms of politics and political fiction. This book really focuses on particularly two characters who are different ages, both talking about, to some degree, well, to a large degree, the queer experience, and particularly gay male experience. And the book basically looks at the various ways that history and politics have coincided with the LGBTQI+ movement, but particularly the kind of personal experiences of those two characters across these different times. They sort of talk to each other in this book, but there are, as the title of the book suggests, sort of blacked out bits of text and bits that are hidden and bits that are obscured. And so the book is really dealing with a lot of this sort of cross-generational conversation around identity. And so you've got, for example, a lot in this book around shame and loss and belonging, and particularly this sort of idea of, a younger gay man having an older gay man tell him what, for example, the HIV/AIDS epidemic was like, or talking to him about the ways that you had to try and meet people in bars or whatever, and the kind of various ways that those things are different. And there's something really beautiful about the kind of meeting of generations in this book that I found really compelling. And I think, again, it would have been quite easy for a book like this to be quite trite or quite sort of saccharine. And I think instead this book is just really punchy. It's just really cleverly done, where there's a lot of heart, but also a lot of anger. There's a real feeling from these two characters that there's something about the malaise of sometimes the malaise of the queer experience that can mean that they're meeting on common ground of understanding each other, but equally so much is different between their two worlds. And I think this book captures that really beautifully. It's so well done, and so it so sort of demands to be listened to, but is also has this real quietness and cleverness going on that I just think is really quite exceptional. So as you can see from the sheer range of books that come up in this shortlist, political fiction can mean almost anything, but I think in a really great way. I think it's a really positive trait of this prize that the last few years, the shortlists have almost all been books that I've absolutely adored, or have found really interesting in various ways. And I think a big part of that is not only that actually I think I quite enjoy books that have a sort of a political edge or a focus or deal with the world as it is. But I think there's also something about the boldness of the writing here. These are 8 books that all very much approach fiction and approach storytelling in a way that really does engage with the world around them. Sometimes those are slightly more grounded in reality. So, you know, My Friends by Hisham Attar, really dealing with some political things that did happen. Sometimes it's these kind of wilder sort of mid spaces like Blackouts that kind of deals with the realities but sort of told through a very personal lens. And then sometimes it's something, you know, like Orbital, that is so focused on something else entirely. I think these books are all really clever and really interesting. I'd really highly urge you to read any of them, any that sound like they would take your fancy. For me, my personal favourites for the win here, probably no surprise given how much I've spoken about them elsewhere as well, but James by Percival Everett I think is exceptional. I think it's a really bold and clever book and very funny, which is hard to do with the subject material in some ways. I think Hisham Attar's My Friends is really deeply clever and powerful and moving. I think Blackout by Justin Torres is equally very, very clever, very moving, very thoughtful. And I think something like Orbital just has this very strange power over me that I think about it and it's just sort of, yeah, this really odd but really interesting book. So I'd quite like, I'm happy for any of these to win, really. Also, you know, the Merle Collins book, Ocean Stirring, that just is a book that I don't think anyone really saw coming. At least not, I didn't. And, you know, it's not a book that has kind of appeared in sort of things I've seen. And I'm really glad for this, that there's a book that I maybe wouldn't initially have picked up or heard about, but just has this really exciting way of telling a very important story. And I think it's just a really well done book. So yeah, all of these I think are great. And although I have, yeah, some of my personal choices for the win, I think they're all very much worth your time. So yeah, please do check them out if you think it'd be of interest. And generally, I just think this is a very exciting prize. It's just really clever books that don't make you feel stupid, essentially, or try not to, I think. Anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts if you've read any of them. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.